a candidate. I'm not giving anything to a candidate. I'm just off doing my thing, okay? We can argue whether or not you're really off just doing your thing, but you know, I'm doing that. So spending, people can generally spend unlimited amounts of money. Colorado, there's a little wrinkle in that. If someone accepts voluntary spending limits, then their contribution limits go up. So it's a bargain that they make with the state, as it were. But generally, no quid pro quo corruption for spending. Contributions, and as a result, the standard of review is very strict on this. Contributions, you have quids for contributions. And the quid is, I'm giving a candidate a contribution limit. And so we have a suspicion that there could be a quo on the other side of that. That would be corruption. So contribution limits are generally upheld pretty strongly. The disclosure side of things, it's a slightly different test. So Buckley versus Vallejo set out sort of a three-part test for this. And the governmental justification for this three-part test is, one, that it helps enforce campaign finance law. In other words, you can see the disclosure, so you can see if someone has violated the contribution limits. So it helps with enforcement. And two, it helps people evaluate. There's an informational interest. It helps people evaluate that, okay? And then three, it helps prevent corruption and the appearance of corruption, because even if you don't violate the disclosure limits, you see someone who's contributed money to a candidate, and then you look at when that person's in office, and all of a sudden they've done something, and you say, aha, there's corruption going in, because I can see the quid, and because of the sunlight as a disinfectant, I can now look at or look for quos and hopefully limit those. So that's sort of how the courts have looked at that. And then, and in Colorado, on the enforcement side, sometimes these come out, and I don't want to jump too far into these issues come up, but let's just talk about, since we'll talk about this a little bit more on the First Amendment side. Let's talk a little bit about just sort of the enforcement system as it were. Now, in my view, okay, and I'll just tell people where I'm coming from, which I think most people in this room know. Campaign finance law is truly a mess. You've got the state constitution, so a lot of stuff is hardwired into the state constitution. You have statutes that attempt to sometimes clarify, sometimes expand, sometimes restrict that state constitution. You have a set of regulations, and then you have a dual enforcement scheme, which sometimes they bump into each other and conflict. And I told Stephen Boo I would call him out. So if any of you have ever seen Pirates of the Caribbean, anyone ever see Pirates of the Caribbean, the very first movie? So there's this great scene where the bad guy is about to make the heroine walk the plank, okay? And he's going to make her, going to kill her. And she says, wait, I invoke the Pirates Code to, you know, invoke this legal provision that gives her apparently certain rights under the Pirates Code for a hearing or something like that, so that she wouldn't be forced to walk the plank. And the evil captain, it was Barbarossa, I think was his name, he says, well, the Pirates Code, it's really more like a set of guidelines. It's not really a law, it's a set of guidelines. So that was his way of ignoring the Pirates Code, because it was a set of guidelines that he wasn't about. So Stephen Bowie has on his CRS, he has entitled it the Pirates Code instead of a set of laws. And that's sometimes what it is, because you have lots of conflicting stuff. Let's just talk about the enforcement provisions real quick. So the Secretary of State's office has relatively limited enforcement. The Secretary of State's office really enforces disclosure. And really the part of disclosure that it enforces is, logically, the Secretary of State reports. So the way to think of that is, and I think the office has probably one of, if not the most sophisticated online filing systems in the country. I mean, it's really a good filing system. But the other side of that, it's like having, when it comes to filing your reports, it's like driving down the road and there is a red light camera and a speed camera on every single block and every single corner. So there are lots of different filing reports, and thankfully, if you try and read the code, the Pirates Code, you will like pull your hair out and go gray trying to figure out exactly who files when, because it's sort of complex. So the office puts together, collates all that and puts together a filing schedule, which saves, what, 50, 100,000 man-hours, person-hours, for people having to try and figure that stuff out. Well, if you are 1 second late in your filing, the office will know about it. And it will generate a late report. And you are caught because of that red light camera. And so, the office is very good if you file a late report. And it will be administratively dealt with. There's a set of rules. There's a little bit of grace period for your, some grace for your first report if it's late and you haven't had other reports late in the past and whatnot. So it's a pretty thorough set of guidelines. So that's what the Secretary of State does. And now and then over the years, people will get mad at the office because saying, well, the office should also report on this and report on this and the other thing. And what happened historically is, a long time ago, is people would, I know this sounds difficult to believe, they would go to the Secretary of State and say, hey, Secretary of State, my political enemy is a jerk and they're violating the law and you need to investigate them. And so the Secretary would have to figure out whether to investigate them. And if they investigated them, then all of a sudden the headline is, candidate so-and-so under investigation by the Secretary of State's office. You wouldn't want to vote for that person under investigation, would you? So that becomes a campaign issue, and the Secretary gets thrown into the middle of it. And that's sort of how the federal system works on the FEC side. Although that tends not to, politically, that tends not to happen as much because it's, I think, sort of a broader playing field and a lot of other federal considerations. So what happened is, and this is before Amendment 27, Article 28, part of that is you have sort of a modified bounty hunter system. So the courts, the administrative courts, have first crack, original jurisdiction, under this stuff. Everything. Spending, contributions, everything. Including failure to file Secretary of State reports on a timely basis. So under here, there's actually concurrent jurisdiction. And sometimes that can be a little bit unclear as to who gets first crack at the bat. Okay? Well, what happens is now, all this stuff goes immediately to the court. So the law says, it's filed with the Secretary of State, and the Secretary just has a ministerial duty. They can look at a complaint and say, this thing's terrible, it's frivolous. And what do? They send it to the administrative law judges anyway, because there is absolutely no discretion among the Secretary of States. So essentially, this is my view, what we've wound up having is essentially sort of the common law of campaign finance law. If you have a question, you sort of figure it out by going to the court. So I oftentimes advise clients when they ask me, well, can I do this and that? And I say, well, maybe, maybe not. It depends on how high of a risk profile you have. And that has a couple elements to it. One is, how active are your political enemies? Because I got news for you. Even though some people say this, no one is non-political when they file these campaign finance filings. They are always filing them against their political enemies. Even if the organization, and there's a few out there, call themselves nonpartisan or bipartisan, good goober government organization, they always file against political enemies. That's the way this works. So the first question is, well, what type of risk profile, what are your political enemies doing? Because the one thing about the FEC, or if the Secretary of State were involved, is you have, ideally, an administrative body which is applying the same rules and the same approach to the enforcement mechanism, to the act of enforcing, okay? You don't have that under Colorado campaign finance law. So it's not like you can go to someone and say, well, you treated them this way, and you should treat me this way, and not enforce it, or do the same thing from the enforcement function. That doesn't exist, because it's a modified bounty hunter system. And I say it's modified is because when the bounty hunter wins, they don't get a bounty. I mean, they don't get money. I mean, they get their man, or their woman, but they don't get a bounty, actually, okay? Well, there have been efforts to allow the bounty hunters to collect attorney's fees in case they win. Those have not succeeded at the legislature. So what you wind up having is essentially sort of the common law, we figure it out in bits and pieces about what works and what doesn't. And whereas the English common law had several centuries to develop itself and whatnot, we don't quite have that level of time here in Colorado. So a lot of times what I will tell my clients, to be frank, is you want to do something, here's the answer. You pays your money and you takes your chances. And so with that, I'll sort of turn over the First Amendment. Because of the challenges in complying with this, and although I've never served as a judge, I am guessing there are similar challenges in applying it from a judicial standpoint, identifying standards on how to wrestle with this body of law. So with that, we'll bring it up.
All right. So Ed Ramey practices public interest and business litigation with the Denver firm of Tierney Lawrence. He represents and works with candidates, political committees, as well as projects of the Colorado Democratic Party. And I should have mentioned that Scott Gessler was the Trump attorney in Colorado, and we're trying to make this a balanced panel, recognizing that there's probably not a lot of truly nonpartisan practice in the area of political, so you are at least getting both sides of it when we call them up here. So we really appreciate them coming to talk today about constitutional issues related to campaign finance in Colorado, and then maybe an update at the federal level. So, you still have your mic, don't you?
No, I'm just going to sit down.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just say, Scott, don't go away.
It's
Is it green or red?
red. No, it's not.
Green's on. So
Okay. All right. Great.
Okay, well, thank you. And Scott, don't go away. Scott and I go way back, by the way, way back to the beginnings of Amendment 27, Article 28, even before then. Matter of fact, it was before Article 28 came along, there was a thing called Amendment 15, which was sort of its predecessor. I was on, strangely, history changed. I was on the other side. I was sort of on Scott's side of many of the issues back then. And we had a 3-case challenge to Amendment 15, the results of which, when that statutory provision went down, was the progenitor of our current Article 28. And my co-counsel in that case, interestingly, were Tim Timkovich, who's now Chief Judge of the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. One of the cases, Wayne Myrie and me on one of them. And the third case, our sort of lead counsel was Jim Bopp, who is the attorney who commenced the Citizens United case from Indiana. And is counsel for National Right to Life, et cetera, which, if you know my political leanings these days, is somewhat different. You'll find, I think, that Scott and I agree on a lot legally, virtually nothing politically. So I'd probably say absolutely nothing politically. We, in the old days, used to end up in court against each other a lot. We still do occasionally, always on the opposite sides. But legally, we have some a good bit in common. I would add something before we get too deep into the constitutional level, and I think this is important in view of some of the cases that are coming down today. We have the concerns with complexity of the campaign finance laws, which Scott was describing. One of his columns that he left out was issue committees, dealing with ballot issues and ballot measures. There's a lot going on, as Matt Grove is sitting here can tell you, from the Attorney General's office, who has the wonderful job of trying to defend these things, sometimes against great odds. And it's his duty to defend them. He has to, whether he thinks there's a constitutional problem or not. But a lot of the focus these days is in the issue committee context, where there are no limits. There have never been limits, well, since the early days of constitutional review of these sorts of things. And not a lot of the concerns that you would find with candidates. No limits on what can be contributed, no limits on what can be spent, and so forth. But for some reason, the focus today is a great deal in that area. I think we want to focus a little bit on that. I'm also conscious of one thing, speaking to administrative law judges, which is a little different for me. Usually I'm on the other end of it. You all are sitting up very high, glaring down at me and explaining to me why I'm about to lose a case, or not, as the case may be. And we're evaluating the constitutional pieces of it. But a real impediment that administrative law judges had is you can't, as you know, and you remind us of this all the time, declare a provision unconstitutional that somebody is pursuing a complaint over. You can, however, and I think you frankly do a wonderful job of this, and it saves the state a lot of money, is you can apply the provisions, the very complex, often conflicting provisions before you in a way that is constitutional as applied, and thereby save Matt and people from the Attorney General's office and the Secretary of State the necessity of having to deal in court with what turns out to be an unconstitutional application. And I think you do that very well. And one aspect of that, one way that you do it, is the discretion that the administrative law judges exercise when the complaints get referred over to them in terms of assessment of penalties. And I'm referring to sort of the Patterson recall precedent, which seems to be adopted across the board with you all, and I think that's been extremely helpful. In other words, if you catch someone who is actually clearly evading and flouting the campaign finance laws and the purpose of the campaign finance laws, they can be assessed the maximum penalties, 5 times a overage of a contribution, $50 a day for being late and so forth. However, if somebody messed up their member attributions for an LLC filing while having timely reported the LLC contribution to a candidate and having done everything else that they possibly could and immediately correcting a problem once it's brought to their attention, there tends, what I've experienced is there is some discretion with the administrative law judges. Scott, weigh in at any time.
Yeah, no, I would, I would sort of call that the stop the madness principle, and that, the stuff is really complex, and so I think what winds up happening, and some of the judges here can comment if they choose, but which they probably won't. But when you look at this, there's sort of two ways I think that judges sort of try to stop the madness on some of this stuff. One is to say, okay, look, there was a violation of the law, but I'm not going to impose a penalty. So there were mitigating circumstances for the violation. It was a good faith effort, but it was nonetheless a violation. The law is a little bit unclear here, and now I'm going to clarify it was a violation. Okay, and it was a violation. But I'm not going to impose a penalty. So you see that happen, or I'm going to impose a relatively small penalty. So you see that happen sometimes as well. And then the other thing is you see the as-applied challenges. So unfortunately, I think, or maybe I should say fortunately, in the campaign finance world, I think the quality of the litigation tends to be, shall we say, a little bit rough and ready. Not because of the lack of brilliance of the attorneys and judges, because they're all very brilliant in the campaign finance bar, of course. But really, you look at the timelines. You file a complaint. It gets referred within 3 days. Hearing is set within 14 days. That is almost always kicked to a later time. But it's still not that late. So it's not like you're doing a full round of discovery under the rules of civil procedure. It's not like you're engaging in an extensive number of depositions. Then you have the hearing, and as soon as that's